What's good, y'all, and welcome back to another edition of Mr. Fitzgerald's biology class. Today we're starting off in our third unit of cell division, and to do that we're going to start talking about something called the cell cycle. So let's kind of dive into that overall and start thinking about it. So you should be writing some stuff down by now of what do you think this means? So the words cell and cycle, break down what you think those mean when we put them together. There is no wrong answer, but it is important that you try to identify what you already know before we start to progress and actually give definitions for what the cell cycle is. So hopefully now you've kind of started to get the idea of what a cell is, right? Cells are the building blocks of all life. All living things are made of cells, and things come from pre-existing cells, right? So we know the cell is a living unit in biology, and we know a cycle is something that probably goes around and around, or something that's repeating, or something that we would see over and over again. So that's kind of the theme that we're going for with this picture here. So this image actually describes the cell cycle, and you should pause this video if you need to actually draw this image. At the top of that big blue section, it says interphase. Down in the orange pie piece, it says mitosis. And then the greenish piece there is cytokinesis. And most importantly, notice these kind of little arrows here showing that it's going around. So you can start at any point. However, it's going to take you all the way through. You're going to progress back to where you began again and continue. So it is an infinite style of process. All right. So let's kind of start to look at these pieces that are within the pie. So here's a similar pie, okay? But instead now it's got more detail. So if you notice in the picture, because the picture usually tells you what's going on, it kind of has some additional pieces like this G1, this S, and this G2. And it kind of gives you some other words here like S, replication, and then G2, it says synthesis of new organelles. So there's additional information in here. But I want to draw your attention to breaking down the word interphase. The word inter, that prefix, actually means between, okay? So inter means between, okay? So this is the phase that's in between overall, okay? The G's here in the phases within interphase, so I have a G, I have a G down here, and I have an S in between. The G's stand for growth, okay? So this is actually, you can anticipate, if those stand for growth, where the cell is gonna either gain size or gain pieces within. You can see where it says for G2, it says synthesize new organelles there. But G1 is where the cell is going to physically grow in size and increase in its volume overall and get a lot bigger. Okay, so during those G phases, the cell is going to grow and just do normal cell functions. It's going to build proteins, it's going to add to its cell membrane, it's going to eat food, it's going to break, it's going to release waste out, it's going to do a lot of things that are related to the cell. The S phase here, if you see it says replication, and to replicate means to copy. If I'm copying something, I'm synthesizing a new one, okay? So S actually stands for synthesis of a new copy or replication, but the question is, what is it copying? Remember, cells have a lot of different parts, and it doesn't say that it's making the organelles, that's G2. So the other piece that is really important to the cell that holds all the information about the cell is DNA. So during this time, during this S phase, that's when DNA is going to be replicated or copied. We got to make identical copies so that way when the cell actually divides, each new cell has a full set of DNA. It has all the information it needs to make proteins and to survive and function. So that's what these breakdowns are. So interphase is the phase in between. And what is it in between? It's actually in between the divisions. So this little chunk here, these orange and green pieces, those are actually where the cell physically divides, okay? Now, we are going to talk a lot more about mitosis soon. We're going to go through all the steps of mitosis because it's a pretty complicated process and it's something that's asked a lot about on tests and quizzes, so make sure that you're prepared for that one. But at a very basic level, mitosis is where the nucleus of the cell actually divides. So when we're talking about mitosis, we're really talking about the division of DNA. So when we talk about nuclear material dividing, that's the stuff inside the nucleus, and predominantly for this purpose of this class is going to be deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. Right? And we'll go into this whole process in a lot more detail coming up soon when we talk about mitosis, but we'll also talk about in Unit 5 how we actually replicate DNA, how we physically make that copy within our cells. So we're going to kind of breeze over it a little bit coming up when we just talk about the stages it goes through to divide. And then we'll get back to the actual more in-depth processes in another unit, okay? Now, cytokinesis, okay? Cytokinesis, hopefully that prefix cyto looks familiar, right? You've seen it before in words like cytoplasm or cytoskeleton. And that usually means it's referring to like the body of the cell, okay? This is when we physically divide the cell into two cells. So we take a large cell like this, and it literally splits into two little cells. Now these will then start to grow and grow themselves and gain more size, replicate their DNA, and then they will go through a split on their own. So you can see how these now 2 cells can make 4 cells, and then 8 cells, and 16 cells. Then it just goes on and on and on with constant doubling and constant growth, okay? Now, hopefully this reminds you a little bit of something in the cell theory. We have talked about within the cell theory that all living things are made of cells, that cells are the basic unit of all life, and where cytokinesis fits in is cells come from pre-existing cells. That final piece where they actually split off into 2 separate new cells is going to be within that cytokinesis and meets the third part of the cell theory. So all this stuff kind of comes back. So nothing from the old units can really be forgotten. It's just there in a new disguise when we talk about the new stuff coming up, okay? Now, just to review again, you got your interphase is that time where the cell is growing, it's developing, it's replicating its DNA, and it's doing normal cell stuff. It's preparing to divide. We have mitosis where the actual nucleus divides as well as the DNA inside the nucleus. And then finally cytokinesis is where we actually split into 2 brand new cells at that point. Okay? Now, why do you think cells need to divide? Could they just stay or could they keep growing? So let's consider the consequences of them keep growing. Okay, so think about what happens during the G1 phase. I've already kind of said that G1 stands for growth of the cell. So if the cell kept growing from a really small thing under a microscope, but it kept going, how big could it get? As big as the slide on the microscope, as big as the desk, as big as the table, as big as the room, as big as the school, as big as the city, as big as the earth. Like it could keep going, right? If it never stopped, it would just keep growing and growing and growing. So we can't have that because think about it, as something that's small and microscopic, the bigger and bigger it gets, it's going to run into more problems. It's not supposed to be that size. So this is called size limitations with a cell. So cells actually have a maximum size they can get to, and it's if you look it up in textbooks, it's called a surface area to volume ratio. They need a certain amount of surface area for the volume that they have to be able to conduct things across their cell membrane. If they get too large, they can't actually move products across their cell membrane efficiently. This could be bringing in new materials, or it could be removing waste. So it's very difficult for the cell to actually survive the bigger it gets. Think about it as a human gets bigger. I'm 6'10", so I have to eat a lot more calories than somebody that's like 4'9", right? Because I have to maintain all this size and structure and all this other stuff around me. My heart has to pound harder. It has to sometimes increase my blood pressure. My body has to go through more stress because I'm larger. There is a limit to how big basically a human can get. And usually the bigger you get, the shorter your life expectancy becomes because it's so much harder on the body to work. Now there are things like medicines and exercise programs and diets that we can all use to kind of stay healthy, but overall, statistically speaking, the larger you are, the less likely you are to live longer because again, there's kind of a limitation that you have there. And it's the same for cells. If they got too big, they can't do their stuff, and if they can't do their stuff, they're not going to be able to actually survive. If it's too inefficient moving materials either within their cells or across their cell membranes, they're not going to get the materials they need to certain parts of the cell fast enough. Maybe they get infected by a virus or bacteria. They can't respond to the attack fast enough because, again, they're limited by their size. That's all I have for today with the cell cycle. Remember, it's a repeating thing, so cells continuously go through this process. And just a fun fact, your skin cells usually do it every 24 to 48 hours. And where does that dead skin go? Piles up on the outside of your skin and eventually falls off and becomes dust on your floor. So the cell cycle is important. It's because that's why you have so much dust in your house. That's all I have for today. Stay dusty, Mr. Fitz.